Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Long Hill Report. We host Richard Morchoe, author of She Searches for Monsters to Destroy, which can be found on Amazon or here. We have, again, Gus Steeves, who has some pretty important stuff to talk about in world history. And it has been, to say the least, an interesting month.
You could say that, yes. I mean, I figured obviously we've talked a lot about the stuff that we have been talking for previous shows, unfortunately, is still continuing. But I thought I would jump to an area that most of the world, to start off with, that most of our people don't really know that much about, which is Central Asia. I don't know if you heard that briefly a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, there was what some are describing as another color revolution in the country of Uzbekistan.
Why don't you explain, take it to
That's what they're claiming it is.
Explain what color revolutions are, because everybody has probably heard of them.
Kind of depends on which side you're looking at. But in the past, we've had, over the last maybe 25 or so years, I guess since the Soviet Union broke up, you had, did it start with what, the Czech and Slovak split? Wasn't that, I think if I remember correctly, that was the Violet Revolution or the Velvet Revolution, where they split up peacefully.
Yeah.
And then they've had a variety of other so-called color revolutions in various countries, that were mostly unsuccessful, of people trying to do one thing or another to either to throw out some government or other. I think the Ukraine has had a couple of them. One of them, I think, was the Orange Revolution I want to say it was like 2002 or something like that. I'm drawing a blank at the moment, but back in that time frame. And so anyway, some of the sources that I've been reading talk about this uprising that's in Uzbekistan, which was actually, from what I understand, more of public protests that may or may not have been stoked from outside. Nobody's really sure. I'm not clear on it. Over the fact that the government wanted to change their constitution to eliminate one section of the country's rights to secede by popular vote, which is kind of an unusual thing to put in your constitution in the first place. But they decided to rescind it. And what I wanted to bring up is the fact that most people don't know anything about that part of the world in our country, which is the fact that that section of the world, kind of to tie in to what we were talking before the camera started rolling, about the Belt and Road Initiative that China and Russia are working on, which it's kind of modeled on the old Silk Road, which ran right through that part of the world. Right. And that part of the world, it really has, and I don't know if you can read this, but this is what that part of the world looked like in the late 1800s, before the Russians took it over. Mm-hmm. Okay, and what's interesting is that part of that friction going on in Uzbekistan is actually kind of a clash between one of the old states that was in that area, Bukhara, and which ruled the area around Bukhara and Samarkand and Tashkent, which is now the capital of Uzbekistan, and the other state that was in that area, which is the Khiva Khanate, which ruled the area right around the southern part of the Aral Sea, which is the area that is talking about secession now. So this is a great example of previous example of Russian, when they took over that area, they created countries that really that shouldn't have existed in the first place. And if you look at the area of the valley, what they call Fergana, which is the really populated section of Central Asia there, it's got borders that look like this, all over the place. Like 4 different countries converge there in this bizarre gerrymandering that makes old Elbridge Gerry puts him to shame. And they did it basically to chop up the Turks that lived in that area, that were more unified than they wanted them to be. So I just thought I'd bring that up as something, as a touch point that's going on in the world at the moment. And from what I understand, as I said, the government kind of rescinded their proposed change. So whether it will go anywhere or not, I don't know. About a couple of months before, it was last year, they had another one of those supposed colored revolutions in Kazakhstan. That actually required military force to suppress.
What's your, you're not getting to the point that who is behind the color revolutions?
Honestly, I don't really know.
Who hitherto has been behind them?
It depends. I think in many cases you see people on the ground, the people in the streets get upset about legitimate reasons. And then I think in many respects, our government or one of the other major Western governments comes in and gets involved for their own interests, which are usually not the same thing as the people on the ground.
Oh, of course not.
But our government's good at taking those interests and twisting them around, and throwing the spin of promoting democracy or promoting humanitarian interests or yada yada, whatever it is of the day. And it seems to me that we're to kind of go back to what we've talked about your book, and it's a perfect example of being involved in places that we don't need to be involved in.
Right.
I mean, as I mentioned during the break, also, I mean, I don't know if people out there are watching out there. We have military forces in Zambia of all places. Why do we want to be there? I can tell you exactly why. Cobalt, large quantities of cobalt. That's why we're there. Not because we have any interest in it, not because the American people benefit from being there. It's because somebody who has a ton of money wants access to even more money. That seems to be driving foreign policy right now.
Well, yeah, the scramble for resources has always been behind imperialism.
Oh yeah,
going back to the Inca.
at least. And to some degree, the Romans were doing it.
Oh,
The
certainly.
Assyrians were doing it.
So the scramble for cobalt is, at the very least, understandable. The question is, if you don't get it, say, cheaply from Zambia, where do you get it? And what happens if you don't get it? And, is it a fungible item that, okay, we don't control it, but can we get it? Can we deal to get it? And that's not something anybody's answering. They're just sending troops.
At the moment, that's true.
No, right now, I mean, first of all, I mean, if somebody, could you tell me what interest do we really have in being in the Middle East? Well, right now, Syria, before Trump got into office, when he was running, he said, the government that comes after what's in Syria now will be worse. But right now, he's bugging that government by controlling, what I guess it's about a third of the land, and stealing the oil.
Yeah, basically.
Oil is far more, as a resource, far more necessary on a day-to-day than cobalt.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
But someone could see why somebody wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. But what we can't argue is it's thievery.
Oh, absolutely. And that's part of the problem.
And the oil is thievery, too.
Well, we see why our government's been trying to make deals with oil petrostates all over the world, whether they're by deals by negotiation or by force. I mean, we used force on Libya. We used force in Iraq. We have more or less done it by negotiation with Saudi Arabia for now.
That deal with Saudi Arabia, which is maybe coming to an end,
it could very well be,
was also the deal to keep our currency. You either paid for the oil in dollars anywhere, or you didn't get oil.
Pretty much.
So the dollar was thus worth something after we took our country off the gold standard.
Right.
So how long that deal is going to to last is a good story. I've heard that and I would suspect this all along, that the Saudis have been fudging their oil reserve figures.
Yeah. I'm sure they have.
So how that's going to go for too much longer?
Well, that's
see.
in fact, it's interesting you mentioned that because I was just reading something a couple days ago, was looking at the idea of how when the U.S. government was trying to put pressure on Saudi Arabia and some of the other major oil countries, to try to replace the amount of oil that our sanctions were trying to keep off the market from Russia, the Saudis basically said, we can't. We're already pumping to beat the band now. We cannot pump anymore. And we're seeing that all over the world now because their big fields are getting to the point where they just can't get any more out of them.
Right.
It's a situation where this is what we should have expected years and years ago. Oil is a finite resource. We will have some degree of oil for a very long time. But, because I don't think we'll ever be able to get all of it. But the issue is that the amount that we can actually afford to get out of the ground and turn into something that's useful for fuel eventually hits a point where we can't afford to do it anymore. And there was something talking about a couple of days ago, was it, which one? It was one of the major investment banks, and I forget which one off the top of my head, was actually talking about the idea of, I think it was $280 a barrel oil, or was it $380? It was one of the two.
Well, that wouldn't.
In the not too distant future, and that could be. That would bankrupt everybody.
That wouldn't happen. We would have a more gradual decline.
Well, that's what we're doing.
If we weren't
That's what we're doing
bugging
now.
Russia.
Yeah.
It's hard to be rational about this because the planning is so difficult.
There doesn't seem to be any planning right now. That's the problem.
For the decline.
Or for the war. It's like they're throwing things at the wall and see what sticks.
But, we're going to have to use oil for a while.
Yeah.
I have the cheapest car to run because I'm a cheap guy. Also, I take pleasure in saying it's probably less inefficient than an electric car, a comparable electric car. And just because you use a battery doesn't mean you don't charge it and you aren't using some kind of fossil fuel to charge it. So, we're not going to think about this in rational terms because it's an irrational situation. But we're going to have to do the workarounds at some point.
Well, and part of the problem is it's such a hard issue to think about because we have so completely lost touch with how dependent on fossil fuels we really are, especially oil, because it's virtually in everything we see now. If it's not being used to transport it, it's literally in it, in one form or another. All of the stuff
Plastic,
in this room, all of the plastics, all of the chemicals, all of the paints, all of the colors, the lights, the glasses we're wearing, the clothing we wear, virtually everything has got some kind of petrochemical in it.
Yes. That doesn't mean there's an easy way out or we can pass a law tomorrow.
Oh, there isn't. Absolutely. It makes it impossible to get out.
So let's just say maybe somebody comes up with a good idea or a more real efficiency. Because, hey, I don't want to freeze. I like where I live and I don't want to freeze.
Nobody else does either. Totally agree.
Moving along here, a very interesting topic came to light. And you've probably heard about it. You know who Scott Horton is.
Yeah.
And he had the big debate with the neocon Bill Kristol. Why we don't have to be fighting everybody in the world all the time.
Right.
And then he had on Peter Zeihan. I don't know if you know who he is.
I recognize the name. I'm not terribly familiar with his thoughts.
Well, after about a certain period of time on his show, he said, I should have had you on instead of
Is it Kristol?
Kristol.
Yeah.
Because he said that Zeihan is predicting in 10 years, China won't even be a country.
We might not be a country in 10 years.
Yeah, but the thing is, China, it got me to wonder because China is more a nation state than we are. I mean, the
Probably true.
Chinese are the country.
Well, yes and no.
There are some minorities,
there are a fair
but they're
number-
tiny minorities relative to the Han.
Well, relative to their population, that's true.
Yeah.
But the tiny relative to the billion Han people is several hundred million people. And some of those minorities are some of those minorities are tens of millions.
Yeah, but still, it's more a nation state than we are.
And what's more important? It's a more unified culture, because they have experience of going through heights and crashes several times in the last 5,000 years. They know how to deal with that.
But he's basically, his point is, and actually comes out to an point for just about most countries in the world. They're going away because they're not reproducing.
Could very be true. Yes.
And that was shocking for everything, whether it's food production, getting the oil, gas from Russia to Germany or anything, that the game, as he has it, is essentially up for human population as we know it. And he has tables, checking out his thing, I don't know, I hope. Some things get overblown. I've heard way too many scare things that we're gonna, the world is gonna end, including what we were talking about in another show about currency and the dollar and everything like that.
Right.
I expected the world to go belly up back in 1975.
It's still there.
And it was a very tough period from the 70s into the early 80s, and the Reagan years, and the Volcker years, and everything like that. But we got through it. This sounds more dead end than that. And I suspect...
Well, if you take it strictly, it would be, literally. But...
It could be worse.
It could be. I mean, I think humanity... part of the problem is that we have such a short sight on history that every time some new catastrophe comes down the pike, we assume it's the latest, greatest, worstest thing to ever hit us. When you go back far enough in human history, we probably experienced it before. Human sight. I mean, we have seen human population been doing this for a very long time.
And then,
then it crashes and then it stabilizes.
I not want to go through that's the extreme of that cycle.
Nobody does.
But it could be an awful thing.
For the people that live through it, absolutely you would be.
But I've gone through.
But people live through it. There are survivors at the end of it.
What is survival under those conditions?
It depends. It can very much depend on how well prepared you are, and whether or not and more importantly, not individually prepared, but more what your community is prepared for.
Nobody is ever prepared for that.
No. But to some degree, more people. When your community is set up in a way to take care of each other in some way with like local food supplies and local resources on hand and local energy supplies
this
that are
is a
simpler
very
and things like that.
optimistic society.
Then you can have. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect because it won't. A lot of people would suffer, but you would have some people that would be able to make ends meet in a way that they survive. I suspect by the time we get to 2100, the human population will be significantly smaller than it is now.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons.
Which means a lot of ecological problems will solve themselves just because,
Yes and no, because, I think part of the problem is that they're all tied into our massive population growth. But whether or not they've been pushed to the limit too far, they will eventually solve themselves. It may not be in a time frame that we would find useful. That's what Mother Nature does things like that. You figure don't jump back really far back in time, back when the asteroids hit us to wipe out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, it took them 10 million years for the ecology to recover. But it does recover. But that's certainly not a time frame anything living then could deal with.
Well,
Hopefully,
Death
nothing like that's going to hit us.
Death
I'm not
has a
saying it
way
will.
of helping you deal with everything. Death has a way of helping you deal with everything.
Yeah, that's true. You don't have to deal with anything after that.
Yeah.
This conversation is going in a weird direction.
Well, this is a worrisome thing in that when he uses a time frame of 10 years,
Yeah.
that does mean something somewhere else is going to be affected.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
that could be us.
So what is he saying? I mean, because I can admit, I have not read much of what he's talking about. What he's talking about.
I
What
don't wanna
exactly
be-
is he saying?
I
It's supposed
do
to happen
not
in the
have
10
him
years.
exhaustive, have him
Yeah.
his arguments exhaustively. I listened to Scott,
Mm.
and then I looked at some things. And when you're basically saying that population is really when you're saying it's falling off a cliff that a country will not exist in 10 years. I suspect he's wrong, but I suspect he's right about the fact that it's a cliff. That the Chinese are falling off. Because they were, being 3 times your age, I remember, they were saying things in the 50s, the Chinese say, hey, we'll use nukes if we have them. This is before they had nukes. Because we got enough people. They were saying that. I mean,
Okay.
think about a country that's saying that they're basically saying too much is our problem, not too few.
Okay.
So they took extreme measures to stop that.
Right.
And
The
now,
one-child policy.
One-child
Which didn't really
policy.
work that well.
what?
Which didn't really work that well.
It worked.
But it's created a huge sexual imbalance in their country
That's
and age imbalance.
yeah.
Yeah.
Such that he's positing that means finito. Now,
Personally, looking at history, I would say that's probably not going to happen. China might go through another period where they have warring states like they have in the past. But I would suspect that China as a culture will survive.
I suspect they will survive as a culture. What
Yeah.
I do not suspect.
They won't. The country as we know it won't survive.
Yeah, and halving. He's basically saying diminishing it really brutally.
Right.
But even halving it would be a big thing that would be difficult to deal with.
Oh, it would be horrific.
And horrific to deal with.
It'd be horrific.
And Korea is basically the civilization
Mhm.
situation.
Well, if you think about it, you're seeing similar. I mean, some of it I think is actually tied into probably the fertility issues that are around the world right now. We see that in multiple cultures. It seems to be, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert in this at all, that there are issues of population of current generations not having enough children to match their own numbers, so that it's declining in most of the advanced cultures, most of the technologically advanced countries. And
Some of them not so technological.
that's true. That's true. And I think a lot of that is because we are A, overtaxing the environment, and B, and partially in the sense of a couple of things. One is all of the pollutants. And I think another one is the fact that we have been so over farming in some places, usually because of industrial farming, that the soil, the quality of the food supply is diminishing. There's evidence to show both of those are problems. And you look at when it comes to the chemicals, there's something like 80,000 chemicals out there, the vast majority of which we don't even know what they do to us because they've never been tested.
Yeah.
Never mind in combination, individually. But all of this stuff was kind of thrown at us back in the 70s with the Limits to Growth study. And they're just being reinforced.
This up. Living out here in the exodus, let's call this area the exodus.
Yeah.
You probably don't see it as much, or we observe it, and we thought about it in different terms. You've got places like California where the water table and the fertility, they just go over.
Right. Right.
Um,
And it's hitting desert really quickly.
yeah.
I mean, they're in the west, southwest is currently in the worst drought it's been in 1,000 years or more. Yeah.
What, there's nothing really they can do about it
Right.
at this point. I was struck by something that may or may not resonate with you. You know, I'm a beekeeper, market gardener, and stuff like that.
Right.
And sometimes I used to throw down buckwheat to suppress weeds. Also, the bees like it. I was getting a little more into it, and I was doing some research about maybe even trying to harvest them.
Okay.
That's a lot of work. You know, if I harvested some, probably end up just going to next year to the bees again.
Okay.
What I was surprised, what shocked me was, I think it was before, either around the turn of the 20th century or 19th, 20th century, or even before that, more buckwheat was growing in this country than wheat. I did not know that.
I didn't know that.
Now, why the change?
Probably because regular wheat is easier to mass farm.
If you have access
To fossil fuels
to
and mechanization.
industrial fertilizer.
Yep.
That's it.
Yeah.
There's no, I mean, you can't make bread out of, well, you can make a sort of a pasta, but it's usually mixed with wheat. Japanese soba noodles.
Oh, okay. I knew that.
But you can't make good fettuccine to go with your pasta sauce and everything. I
Okay.
don't think you can do that. So maybe it's a more versatile food itself. But it shocked me that it was not, that the top grain was buckwheat.
That is interesting. It doesn't really surprise me, though. If you look at history, we have seen a whole slew of different perfectly edible, nutritious food kind of drop by the wayside as industrial agricultural forms have taken over in various crops, whether it be soybeans or wheat or corn or whatever. Even within corn, for example, there used to be dozens of varieties. Now there's basically 3, maybe 4. You know, the biggest primary one, of course, is the sugar corns. A couple of varieties of those. But I mean, there were dozens. They used to be able to grow corn in places like Maine, which they had been adapted to Maine. Or there was corn that I remember reading about that the Hopi used to grow that would be able to grow under like 6 inches of sand. Our corn can't do that.
Well, the Abenaki in Maine certainly were not growing wheat.
Totally not wheat, no, but they had some corn
They had corn.
in the river valleys. In the river valleys.
They lived on
Yeah.
even before they colonists came.
Yeah. Well, that and a lot of hunting. And I think that's part of it is that we have become so overly reliant on a few crops that the ecological issues we're seeing may very well hit us harder because we haven't diversified.
Saying the ecological aspect would be the dependence on fertilizer.
Well, that plus climate change plus drought. I mean, they all hit the farmers. All of them do. But if you think, for example, like one of the things that we try to do at our houses is we actually eat the weeds. Some of them anyway. I can't say we're not experts at it by any means.
You can grow your own wheat.
Weeds, W-E-E-D-S, as in like stuff that just kind of pops up naturally. You know, we'll eat sorrel occasionally. We make things with our lamb's quarter, which is actually a form of amaranth, and that used to be much more commonly grown. In fact, that was, if I'm not mistaken, that was a common crop in Indian America, and it was like Jerusalem artichoke and the which is kind of misnamed because it really isn't from Jerusalem and it's not an artichoke. And they used to grow sunflowers and a variety of other things that we take for granted as very minor crops today, but they were able to live on them. and wild rice and a variety of other things that they harvested rather than grew.
Well, nobody, for good or ill, I don't think people are going to go back to tobacco. Even unless there is an absolute ban on the potash that we import to fertilize with. Because the Russians, and I think the Canadians, I think they more or less have a monopoly on it.
Canada does?
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
Russia.
I don't know for sure.
I know Russia has a lot.
Mm-hmm.
One could hardly blame them if they said, well, we can try to get a piece.
Given the way we would be treating them, no. But then again, if you think about it, we were able to grow food to support the population at the time. I don't know if we could support the population we now have without all of those industrial imports for a long time, because we focused on doing it locally as opposed to having stuff that we could ship all over the place.
The word focus, does anybody really focus? I mean, they'll do it because they have to. You may, I may, certainly, but a lot of people can't. You know, I
don't know.
As time is winding down here, I saw a horrible statistic that 2 out of 3 kids growing up, high school kids, college, high school graduates, don't know who we declared independence from. That says a bit of aimless life.
It says a lot about, well, it's not so much an aimless life, it says a lot about vast holes in our educational system. Which makes me wonder why, well, actually I guess back to who benefits from having an ignorant populace. It certainly isn't us. But, well, and in the short term maybe they do, because an ignorant populace is easy to manipulate. In the long run, however, of course, that tends to come back and bite them.
Well, as Lord Keane said, in the long run, we're all dead.
This is true.
And the show is actually, I've just been told, is dead. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and we'll see you next month. Thank you, Gus.
Have a good week.